Lucia Bєл will just wait a second. You can see the title of her presentation. Competencies is really important for legal translation. Doctor of the University of Warsaw, Institute of Applied Linguistics, Poland. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here because EU translation, I've been researching EU translation for some 10 years in the context of Polish and also in more general terms. And I really think that EU translation is a fascinating phenomena, partly because it's so complex, and on the other hand, it works. So it is really a very interesting topic for research and for leading this kind of academic life on it. I will be talking about competences for EU translation. And let me first start to define what is meant by EU legal translation. EU translation as such is a very, very broad topic. It does not only cover legal texts, although legal texts are very visible because of their importance. So this is a template which was prepared by the European Commission for quality assurance reasons, and they classify EU texts which are translated into category A of legal documents, and this category covers EU legal acts, documents used in administrative or legal proceedings and inquiries, documents for procurement or funding programs, tenders, grants, grant applications and contracts, as well as recruitment notices and EPSO competition notices, as well as test documents. The other category is category B of policy and administrative documents, which covers documents which are not formally part of legal acts, for example, white and green papers, other official administrative documents, budget reports and guidelines. Category C is information for the public, and this is a very important category of documents which covers different types of communication between the institutions and the general public. It's very important that those documents are written in clear language, that they are formulated in natural language which reads well, which is accessible to the general public. And category D, input for EU legislation, that is policy formulation and different subcategories of documents. I will be focusing on category A, that is legal acts and case law mainly. So I think that EU translation can be defined by a range of parameters, and we had quite a lot of today on EU translation, and one of those parameters are institutional aspects, political aspects, legal aspects, and supranational and multilingual aspects. So let me start with legal aspects. First of all, we have different types of litigation and other legal risks involved in their translation. We have different hierarchy of legal sources. We have a certain scalability of the legal component in EU texts. What is also very important to remember is that EU law is regarded as a supranational law with autonomous concepts, which on the other hand is also kind of a hybrid, and I will refer to this later on. And as Fernando Prieto Ramos observes, as Fernando Prieto Ramos says, the legal documents in institutional settings are linked to three interrelated processes, that is lawmaking, implementation, monitoring, and adjudication. As for the institutional axis, if we want to define EU legal translation or EU translation in general, we can define it as translation which is rendered mainly by EU institutions, also translation which is rendered for EU institutions. As Kaisa Koskinen says, institutional translation is a kind of self-translation, where institutions use translation as a means of speaking. Okay? And translators become a very important element in that process. The fact that we deal with institutional translation also means that we have a range of norms which control and standardize the behavior of translators. They impose certain institutional patterns of behavior. As for the political component, what is really important is to remember that EU is a kind of a political system built on and mediated through translation. EU texts are shaped in a specific political context and are subject to complex negotiations and political compromises between member states. For this reason, EU law is sometimes referred to as diplomatic law. EU texts vary as to the different levels of political sensitivity, political visibility, and political priorities, and those factors should be taken into account by translators. EU legal texts in this group are typically associated with very high political risks and are marked by a frequent use of what is known as strategic ambiguity or deliberate uncertainty. That is, it may be vague on purpose to reflect a kind of a political compromise or a lack of compromise. And if this is the case, translators are required to maintain the same degree of ambiguity, not to disambiguate something which was left ambiguous on purpose. Another aspect is the supranational component, in the sense that it means that on the one hand we deal with a kind of a supranational organization which uses its own legal framework. However, this framework was not built from a tabula rasa, but it's a kind of a synthesis of constituent national components. And for example, it's claimed that in particular, at first French and German law was very influential as regards EU law, and later on the UK law as well. So we have a certain interplay between supranational and national elements within this legal framework. Okay? What Annalisa Kier says in a very interesting paper she published in 2007 is that EU law is drafted within the supranational system, but exists thanks to its transposition, application, and enforcement in national legal systems. So it has, in a way, it has this kind of double life. Yeah? And as a result, some kind of a double coding of concepts. As for the multilingual axis, as has been remarked several times today, we have 24 official or working languages which enjoy an equal status. This is the official narrative. However, out of it we have procedural languages, that is, they form some kind of an elite club. English, French, and German. Currently, as we all know, it's English, which is the main drafting language. However, French is also important because it's still a single working language in the European, in the Court of Justice of the European Union. We also have what is known as pivot languages: French, English, German, Spanish, and Italian. That is those languages which are used as a kind of a relay when you don't have translators who cater for a given language pair. So, for example, if you need translation from Polish into Finnish and you don't have this language combination, you would probably go through English. Okay? First from Polish into English and then from English into Finnish. It results in a kind of declared multilingualism and a kind of actual practice, which is not fully multilingual. It's simply done for practical considerations, that it's not all the documents are obviously translated into all official languages. Only certain categories of documents are translated into all the languages. So EU institutions refer to this as controlled full multilingualism or a pragmatic approach to multilingualism or selective approach to translation. Some scholars are more critical, like Ruf Wodak and Krzyżanowski talk about hegemonic multilingualism, or Heikki Mattila talks about unilingualism. Okay? So these are 2013 data for languages which are used in drafting. About 81% of documents are drafted in English. For legislation, it's about 90%. But if you look at 97, there was a completely different kind of percentage, which is also important to bear in mind that in the past, documents tended to be drafted in French as well. So sometimes it's really important to consult the French version, especially if you are dealing with a document which was drafted in the 80s or in the 90s, but it's still binding. So, English is currently a lingua franca of the EU, of the European institutions. It's the main drafting language, but it also has to be remembered that it's not like a single drafting in English, simple drafting in English, and then translation into all the languages, official languages. This is only part of the story, because the process is very complex and multi-stage and multilingual. So you have the first draft in English of a law, then you have it translated into other official languages, then you have negotiations, which are mainly conducted in English, but they can also be, the documents can be consulted in national languages. So you have, in the end, you have a kind of a fusion of languages and the text going back and forward with the mediation of English. It's also important to remember that the majority of texts are prepared by non-native speakers of English. If you look at the statistics of nationalities employed in the European Commission, you will pretty soon realize that most of the documents are drafted by non-native speakers of English as well as non-native speakers of French. Okay. Multilingualism is also divided into two types. That is the single meaning approach, which applies to EU legislation, where all language versions are de jure authentic, which means it's full multilingualism, even though it's possible to identify a de facto original, that is English. The case is different for the case law, where you have the so-called single text approach, where only one language version is deemed by the Court of Justice to be authentic, and this is a judgment in the language of the case, while as opposed to a de facto original that is French, because everything is mediated through French. Okay. So after this lengthy introduction, I'm ready to move on to discuss competencies for EU legal translation. What we know from translation studies is that EU translation poses quite a lot of challenges to key translation studies concepts, such as, for example, the source text, which is unstable, which is recycled, the target text, which becomes a language version, an authentic language version, an equivalence which is proclaimed through authentication, that is publication in the official journal, and as well as this kind of drafting, which could be, as well as the translation process, which can be described through drafting, multilingual drafting. Okay? So as for training needs, we need legal translators as well as other specialized translators who know other areas. We need qualified interpreters. We need lawyer linguists, that is, people who have legal training and have an excellent knowledge of two EU languages, at least two EU languages, revisers and reviewers, legal revisers, which is a special category of lawyer linguists who do not do translation as lawyer linguists in the court, terminologists, and quality managers. What we know about the ideal legal translator is a kind of a superhero by Szarczewicz, who says that the ideal legal translator should have a thorough knowledge of legal terminology, legal reasoning, and target and source legal systems, the ability to solve legal problems, analyze legal texts, and foresee text construal, that is interpretation. An ideal legal translator should also have drafting skills and basic knowledge of comparative law and methods. And Szarczewicz concludes that such an ideal translator does not exist. But it's kind of an ideal to strive to become. As for translation competence, we have a range of models. Most popular ones are the Emt Competence Models prepared by the European Masters for Translation Expert Group in collaboration with DGT. We have a very influential PACT model and adjustments of those models to legal translation, the most well-known by Federica Scarpa and Daniel Orlando and by Fernando Prieto Ramos. So, according to the Emt Competence Framework, published in 2017, translators should have competence in the area of language and culture, translation, technology, personal and interpersonal competence, as well as service provision. However, I will refer to the old framework, which is more useful for my purposes, because and especially from the point of view of legal translation. And I will focus on language competence, thematic competence, technological, and information mining competence. So, as for language competence, it's very important from the perspective of universities to train translators in more than one language. In some countries, like for example in Poland, we had the tradition of philology studies where translators were trained mainly in one language, very thoroughly in one language. This is not enough for EU translation purposes because, as was already mentioned, you often have to consult other language versions when you translate. So it's critical to have one of the languages that is one of those procedural languages, preferably English, because English or French, and some other language out of the pool of the EU languages. And it might be interesting to look for combinations which are, for example, based on some kind of similarity between languages. Yeah? We saw some examples, for example, some usefulness of consulting Slavonic languages in the case of Ukrainian. Yeah? This is also, interestingly, this is called by some scholars as the Rosetta Stone technique, when you do a translation of EU law and when you consult other language versions, because of the kind of condensed, implicit nature of English, yeah? Compared to, for example, very analytical structures which are required by Slavonic languages, and we saw that today. Okay. The EMT framework says that one of the components of language competence should be developing sensitivity to changes in language and developments in languages. This is very important from considering that EU translators develop a new legal variant of national languages. It's a kind of a hybrid variant which is adjusted to the needs of supranational law. And we have to face it. Its reactions initially may be quite difficult. It was, for example, a case of Polish. It took some time before people got used to this kind of a new variety of language. But you have to realize that this variety is different on purpose because it serves supranational law, not national law. Because of that, it's some kind of misunderstanding. EU translations and EU language has some bad reputation. And it has a range of nicknames, like, for example, Eurolag is perhaps not is neutral, but you can hear such descriptions as Eurish or Eurojargon, Eurorhetoric, Eurospeak, Union Legalese, Eurofog, or Eurobabble. And as Koskinen says, EU translation is marked by the extreme visibility of translatedness of the text. Okay? But some people say that, okay, the conceptual, the terminological layer, it has to be different, but does it have to be so different in the case of other levels of language? Translators should make efforts to ensure that even though it's EU translation, it does not depart from the conventions of the national language in places where it is possible. Okay? There is some high probability of distortions, of creating a kind of a translationist due to the source language interference. For example, in the case of Polish, we do some very complex corpus research on Polish translations, and we compare them to Polish legislation. And we can say, for example, that we have quite large differences in the use, for example, of passive voice, which is overused in translation under the influence of English, or we have a lot of subordinate clauses which are used which are not that frequent in natural, non-translated Polish. We have a different use of deontic models, that is how you impose obligation on somebody. Yeah? So in Polish we would say jest obowiązany do, is obliged to do. Why when you read EU legislation you have a lot of musi, powinien, yeah? Which is not the typical of Polish legislation. You obviously have some phraseological neologisms or some new structures, like what turned out to be very difficult was and still is without prejudice to. which is quite challenging in some languages. And Polish has first opted for the literal translation, then there were a number of attempts how to replace it with something more natural, but it's still some of a challenge. Or for example, such a structure as ensure that, which is one of the most frequent phrases used in directives, because directives say what a given country should ensure. The problem is that you cannot say ensure that in Polish. You have to say ensure something. Okay? However, EU translators wrote to the Polish Language Council, which is kind of a language authority in Poland, and said, well, look, it's really difficult for us because EU directives have this ensure that, and we cannot use a noun because the structure in that is so complex that we really need to have a subordinate clause here. Otherwise, we really risk that that our translation will distort the source language. And the Polish Language Council said, yes, we authorize, you can use this kind of, we create officially this kind of structure in Polish. Okay? So you may have this kind of unexpected impact on a national language. However, translators have to be very sensitive to where such innovations, some would say distortions, are permissible and when they are not. Okay? So for this reason, it's very important to work very closely with linguists, for example, Ukrainian linguists, to prepare some kind of guidelines for translators how to deal with certain problems and how to, first of all, have a list of the most difficult problems and some recommendations to standardize the behavior of translators. Okay. As was already mentioned, EU law is very, very diverse in the range of topics it covers. Therefore, it's very important to pay attention to thematic competence of translators. Okay. There are certain areas which are much more popular and much more frequently regulated at the supranational level, for example, competition, consumer protection, the environment, agriculture, but there are some areas which are less regulated. So it's important to have resources, especially in those areas which are well regulated. This may be a problem when translators are trained in this kind of the philology settings, where you have mainly training in literature, highbrow literature, linguistics, and you don't have that much training in specialized areas. Yeah? Then you have the need to develop some tailor-made CPD courses. Tomasz Swoboda recommended the book, we edited, and there's a very interesting paper by Karolina Stefaniak from the Polish language department of the DGT, who worked for quite a long time as a terminologist, and she says that about 90% of terminological problems they encounter are not with legal terminology as such, but are with technical, very technical, specialized terminology in other areas. Yeah? So it's also, once you develop this kind of new layer of terminology for legal concepts, the main obstacle next is a technical or specialized terminology. Yeah? Okay, I don't have, I think I'm running out of time, but just to, okay. Another aspect of thematic competence is to understand how how different types of legal texts should be dealt with. For example, when you have directives which define the objective to be achieved, they are formulated in a kind of vague general language which is much more flexible in order to accommodate solutions in different countries. And as Wagner and others say, it's very important not to replace supranational concepts at this phase, because you are trespassing into the territory of national parliaments. And this is often a source of misunderstanding, because national lawyers often say, well, translators, EU translators don't know the national legal terminology. But there's a very important reason for it. The main reason is that we are dealing with supranational concepts, and that was nicely presented in the previous session. Information mining competence. In the case of legal translation, you need to identify correct legal sources and be able to evaluate their reliability, as well as to work with specific resources, technological resources, use technology in order to ensure that your translation is standardized. Like, for example, my students love to use Lingui and DeepL, which was mentioned, both of them were mentioned today. And they even do it when we train them in EU translation, but it's very, very misleading. Even though all those resources are based on publicly available EU resources, you really need to know when specifically you have to consult Eurolex and check what's there, rather than rely on some general sources. And it's very important to train students to work with such resources and to know that they know their responsibility for checking everything in such resources in the first place. Okay, I skipped that. And just to conclude, I think that it's a very fascinating moment for Ukraine, where you are forming the Ukrainian Eurolect. A very, very fascinating time. And based on my research in the Polish Eurolect, I can say that it does take time before it's stabilized, before you have all the resources in place, before they are reliable, before you have solved a lot of different problems. And I think in the case of Polish, it was about 10 years before it stabilized fully. However, now we have much more technological resources, that it may be faster depending on the scale of EU translation. And I would, since some of you are academics, as I understand, or work in the academia, I would really like to encourage you to do some research on Ukrainian Eurolect in the making, because it's just a very, very interesting linguistic phenomenon in how you adopt your language for supranational purposes. Thank you.